So now we're starting off a session on spatial prediction. And Keenan was saying to me, why am I the second last to present? And obviously it's that we're saving the best session for last. So I hope that this is gonna, we've got our coffee and we're gonna be energetic and fist pumping through the end of the day. And I'm pretty excited to start off this talk because I'm gonna start off with a little bit of like why we would even wanna spatially predict things in the first place. And then give a little intro to a framework I built to give you a bunch of different options for spatial prediction, specifically geostatistics. So I think the first question is like, why would you want to spatially predict anything? And often the answer is that it's something that we either want to better track, to control, or to encourage. And so I'm going to start with a common example in one of the fields I work, which is public health. And I'm going to use the example of Nigeria, which is shown here. Nigeria is a really interesting case because in some parts of the country, the healthcare is similar to the US or parts of the US, and in some, it's among the worst in the world. So here, the outcome we're looking at is child stunting, which is chronic malnutrition that leads to children being shorter than expected for their age. And you can see that, across the country, there are places where there was a survey that measured hundreds of data points, thousands of children. And at some data points, none of the children, typically like 5 to 20 were sampled, and none of them had stunting. And in other parts of the country, over 80% of them had signs of child stunting. And so I know that this is sort of a grim example if you're not sort of used to this kind of work, but we map this stuff in order to make it better. So let's use this as our example. And now I think that you can be forgiven if you don't know anything about child stunting in Nigeria, but I guarantee that you know enough to answer the next question. So I'm going to ask for a volunteer here. Who dares to volunteer? Matt, what do you think child stunting is like around point A, like a number between 0 and 1?
I would guess that between 0 and 1.
Or 0 to 100%.
0 to 100%. I would guess that it's probably like around 10 to 15%.
Okay. And what would you guess around point B?
North of 60%.
Congratulations, you understand child stunting in Nigeria. So why did we, that was a pretty, I think a lot of us probably were thinking that even if we didn't raise our hands. And like, why do we sort of intuitively know that? And I think the answer is that one of them is that we think of things in terms of spatial autocorrelation. I think as geography people, you might know this term, but I think even people who don't intuitively think that nearby things tend to be more similar than distant things. And so here, obviously, A is surrounded by a bunch of low points, B is surrounded by a bunch of high points, and so we can sort of guess, with some level of uncertainty, that's probably what A and B look like. So if you were in like an intro GIS class, you might have modeled like a geostatistical surface where 2 points next to each other have like some level of variability, but they're pretty similar. And as you go farther and farther out until you get to this range, things become more and more different until basically they're like uncorrelated. So we can look at this and we can measure it in observed data, but we can also model it. So we can say, like, let's go from all these observed data points to this underlying surface where we have some uncertainty, but basically we think that things tend to be higher in one part and lower in other parts. So that's sort of one aspect of spatial intuition that's going to help us with spatial modeling. Then, of course, the other aspect is like there might be some sort of underlying factors that are causing child stunting. Obviously, a one would be like economic activity, wealth of families in that area, ability to actually like farm or buy the food to eat are all potential drivers of stunting. And so we could think about, maybe A is surrounded by high points, but if it was a particularly poor area or particularly rural, that might be sort of a an outlier in that area. Or if B was like a thriving metropolis, we could think of that as being also very different from the surrounding points. And so here I've pulled out a bunch of data that we can find either from satellite-derived data. Sometimes we find it from other spatial models or from things like travel time analyses, like travel time to healthcare. So again, spatial covariates we can think of as almost like drivers or associative factors that can help us with our spatial models or our spatial predictions. And then there's a question of like, well, we think those things are probably associated or correlated, but then how do we get from those factors to our outcome? And so we could think about doing this in terms of a regression model where we say, let's just have some linear association between these two variables and then add a bunch of those together, and that's our outcome. Or we could think about like maybe there's nonlinear associations, maybe there's interactions between covariates, and so we want to do something fancier like a machine learning model. So two sort of possibilities there, but these are all things, all sort of like resources that we can marshal when we're estimating this, around the country. And so what I'm sort of getting at of like what we want to do when we're doing spatial prediction is go from observed data. Maybe this is like sampled point data like it is here. Maybe it's just like points and lines. Maybe it's generated from some sort of surveillance system like the crash surveillance system around Seattle. But we want to go from those observations to understand something about the data generating process. What was actual stunting like in the country and around the country that generated this data? And because that's what we really care about. So we care maybe about estimating the underlying probability or risk. Maybe we want to make estimates in unsampled locations, like in points A and B and all these other points around the country. So we can say things not just about specific points, but about like districts or counties or states and compare those with some level of uncertainty. We know that these are just small sample sizes. When you have maybe 100,000 people sampled across a country, you can say, there's just a number here because it's 50,000 out of 100,000. But when it's 5 out of 10, that's a very different level of confidence that you have in the actual risk. So we want to capture that. And then finally, I think all of these are thinking about sort of like causal models. Whenever you're making a prediction, you're sort of thinking about causation in some sort of way. And so depending on how much contextual information you know about the problem, you can also start to ask things about counterfactuals or like interventions that would help change this based on the model. And so just to sort of reframe this, we're going to think about spatial regression as using geolocated observations like that point data to predict an outcome across space. So we know that uncertainty in the input data matters. So for example, an observation of 10 out of 30 is more certain than 5 out of 15, just because there's fewer people sampled. And it's taking advantage of spatial structure in the outcome, either spatial autocorrelation, relations with spatial covariates, and other grouping factors like administrative boundaries. Maybe there's 2 different Medicaid policies across states. So I built a package to, you might have questions about, well, do I want to do A, B, C, or D? And the answer is yes, you want to try all of them. And traditionally, you had to have like a grad degree to get into some of these like spatial autocorrelation, like building these very specific spatial data structures and running machine learning models. And I thought that was sort of unfair to people who were maybe subject matter experts, but not experts in spatial modeling. So I built this MBG package, which stands for model-based geostatistics. And you can find it, it's an R package. You can find it either hosted on GitHub or on CRAN, the Comprehensive R Archive Network. And we're going to look at how to basically run a model, given all the data we've just looked at in MBG. So let's get into math. There are a lot of letters on here, and there's a lot of model terms, but bear with me because we're going to see this in practice. So we want to relate our outcome data, which is like sampled point data with a numerator and denominator, to some underlying probability or risk surface. So here we're looking at a binomial, which is basically just a way of saying you had n sampled at point I, you had y positives, and there's some underlying probability or risk p, which is p is what we really care about from point to point across the country. And we think there's some structure to p. It's not just random. We saw that there's spatial association across a country. And so what we're going to look at is just our mean, which is beta 0. That's just the average across the whole country. And then we can think about the effects of covariates at each different location, so those potential drivers. You could either think about just not including covariates at all, maybe you just want to look at the spatial associations. You could think about like so we call this a generalized linear model, but this is really just a type of linear regression where you just have linear effects on each of the covariates, x. Or you could have this stacked ensemble model, which is an idea that you run a bunch of different machine learning models on the data, so that's that G. And then you basically put a weighted average on those, and what comes out is going to be probably the best of all the averaged models. And then, okay, so we can think about that as like the covariate effect on the outcome. But maybe we also just want to look at spatial associations. We don't know about any particular drivers, or we think there's extra variation in there that isn't captured by covariates. And so there we want to look at this structured spatial term. So we can think about this, if you've ever pressed the Kriging button in ArcGIS, it's doing something like this. We can also think about it as like a Gaussian process regression. But it's basically this surface where things are correlated across the surface, but things that are closer together are more strongly correlated than things that are far apart. So that's another term that we can choose to add or just ignore. And then we talked about having structured admin effects, like structured state level effects. And so we could think about like some sort of underlying normal distribution of all the states or all the counties across a country. And each county falls somewhere in that normal distribution, but it's the same effect across the entire county. And you go to a different county and it's somewhere else on that normal distribution. And so that we think about that as like a structured spatial effect, or it's just a structured kind of group level effect, rather than like a continuous spatial effect. And then finally, there's this nugget effect. This is the idea, it came from gold mining, that when you dig a hole, you might just find a gold nugget anywhere, even if you weren't expecting it. And so this is that level of error or sort of uncertainty that comes from 2 points measured in the same place. They're not going to be exactly the same, even if all their factors are the same. Okay, so let's actually look at that in practice, because that was a lot of letters and Greek letters to throw at you at once. So we've got our point observations, which we were looking at, stunting in Nigeria, and we've got these spatial covariates. So first, if we're going to go sort of the fancy machine learning route, let's train some machine learning models. And when you ask, well, is it going to be better if we do like a penalized regression or like a smooth spline or like a random forest? The answer is yes. Let's just do all of it. And we'll come out and we'll get estimates from each of those potential types of models. And you'll see that because those models are making sort of different assumptions about the relationships between the drivers, the covariates, and the outcomes, they come up with slightly different estimates, especially in places that weren't sampled. So you can see that there are these big gaps in the points here, and you can see that there are slightly different estimates that are coming out from each of those models, especially where are the gaps. You can also see sort of the covariate effects are changing a little bit, like different covariates come out in different models. You can tell, for example, that in this bagged regression trees model, it like sort of glommed onto the latitude and longitude as like there are just spatial cut points where you can see increases or decreases in the outcome, versus some of these seem to be a little bit more focused on like urbanicity, for example. Okay, so we've got all our different models, and now it's a question of like, how do we get towards the best one of those? Because now we've got all these different observations. So like, how do we combine those in a way that feels sort of principled and actually gets toward the outcome? So what we're going to do is this stacked ensemble model, and so that is a weighted average across all these different models, where the weights sum to 1, and the closer a model is to predicting the correct outcome, the higher the weight is, basically. And so what we're going to do, we're going to have this. We're going to assume that in this case, that there's some sort of like structural correlation, spatial structure in the error term. That's where we get that 2D Gaussian process. And then we're going to just have a little bit of error because a point is going to be high or low, and that's just a function of the data of being noisy. So what we're going to do is this is sort of fit in this kind of like Bayesian framework where we're going to repeatedly step the model. We're going to see how well did that predict, and that's going to give us information about, well, the weight on this one should go up, the weight on this one should go down, and we should actually change the smoothing term a little bit. And that's going to then influence every other parameter in the model. So we step it again, until we get this sort of candidate map, or 1,000 candidate maps of the best fitting model. So when that comes out, what we basically have is a function that takes all the covariates and the spatial location and turns it into estimates. And there's some uncertainty in that function, and so what we're actually going to get is like 250 or 1,000 samples of different types of maps. And when you do that, you can sort of summarize those different maps. So you can say, we had 1,000 different estimates that were all sort of like in a pattern. And when we took the average across that, so let's say we have 250 draws. This is the average of these 250 draws. So that's sort of our best estimate for each pixel in the country. And then we've also got some uncertainty in those draws. And so you can see here, again, like we've got up to no uncertainty to up to 30% uncertainty. And the uncertainty increases as it gets farther away from sampled data. So here we've got pixel level stuff, but again, I think one of the powerful things about these maps is that it doesn't have to be at the pixel level. You could go up to an administrative division, and you've still, because you've got these candidate maps, you can just aggregate them in different ways, and the uncertainty still remains. So now we can go from having our gridded estimates, let's just take a population surface and some administrative boundaries, and we can just population weight it up to this. In this case, I think this is about 680 counties of Nigeria or districts of Nigeria, and you can see that there are state boundaries that we could aggregate up to as well, while keeping all of that uncertainty in a principled way. And so here what we're seeing are the averages by district or local government area, and then the uncertainty across those same units. So okay, you're probably like, that seemed like a lot, and it was probably like a real headache to code. So let's put it all together. This is just showing the process from start to finish. And basically, we just started with our point observations, our covariates, and what you didn't see was the spatial boundaries of the country as well. But actually, to code this up, in MBG, it's just 2 lines of code. So we've got, and actually, a lot of this is going to look pretty familiar. So we're creating this model runner, which comes from the MBG package. And what we've got are input data, gridded covariates, which we saw before, gridded population, which is just one of the covariates, and then some information about our prediction space and what kind of administrative boundaries we want to aggregate to. So then you run it, and I've got some toy data in the tutorial, and you can run something small. I think it's the country of Benin in like less than a minute. All of that runs. So that's one example, but I want to sort of lighten the mood a little bit by having an outcome that's a little happier. So I'm going to talk about walkability. As many of you know, I have this map called CLOSE, which looks at multimodal travel times from various destination types to every block in the country. You can go see it at close.city. I won't get too much into it because I've given other talks on that. But I think the question I get a lot from that is like, what's the point of being close to stuff? Like, how can you actually measure the effect on people walking places versus just saying, well, I'm close to a grocery store, but am I actually going to walk there? Unfortunately, we have some sampled point data that tells us exactly that. The Puget Sound Regional Council has conducted this regional travel survey for the past, I think, 8 or 10 years. And every time they have a little bit of information about a person's, like anonymized, but a person's approximate location across the Puget Sound. And they also give all of their trips over about a week period and the proportion of those that were car versus bike versus transit versus walking trips. And so what we can ask is what proportion of trips did people take that were walking trips versus any other type of trip? Or what proportion of trips were car trips versus any other? So these are all the mode types that weren't car. And you can see this is sampled, it's messy, but it's like all the exact same structure that we looked at before. This can be modeled. Unfortunately, with the data in CLOSE, we've got all these points, but we've also got this really multifactorial data set of all the predictors related to travel time. So what's the travel time to the closest destination? How many destinations of a certain type are within 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes? And the great thing about this model is that we can say, we don't have to choose at the start. Let's put them all into a machine learning model and see what comes out. And we can get this estimate of multimodal trip proportion across every pixel, and that means every neighborhood or city council district in the city. And one thing I'm really excited about is that you can, not only predict things and like make sort of, policy statements based on this, but I think this is something where we know a little bit about the underlying data, and that, adjusting for certain demographic factors, we should expect there to be a relationship between being really close to stuff and being able to walk to that stuff. And so we could say, as like a policy experiment, what happens if we put a new school here? What happens if we open a new grocery store in this neighborhood? And ask the questions about like what the ultimate change in this this walkability would look like. So that's something I'm excited about. And I'll just say quickly, I know I've got only a couple minutes left here, but you should always be looking at, there's this branching path thing that happens when you've got all these different options. And just because it's really easy to toggle things on and off doesn't mean that you should toggle them all on. So a sort of principled way of looking at this would be doing cross-validation. You split the data into 5 or 10 pieces. You run a model based on 90% of the data, and then predict out to the other 10%, and basically decide which ones are predicting out on the sort of unmeasured data the best. And so there's the question about like what kind of evaluation metrics you want to use. If you've taken a stats class before, you're familiar with RMSE, root mean squared error, and that's sort of good as like a point-to-point approximation. There's also things you can do when you have uncertainty, like in these Bayesian models. You can use this posterior predictive density. So if you're getting a lot of estimates that are like right in the middle of your data, that looks really good. But if the data is all really far from the center of your estimates, that's a lot less good. And just to say that there are functions to do this really easily in our package as well. Okay, so last thing I wanted to mention briefly. Some people are like, why do we need all this nonsense? Let's just ask ChatGPT. And I will suggest that if ChatGPT gives you some code and like reasons to like, run a regression model, that's okay. But if it just gives you an answer, don't listen to it. LLMs are pretty bad at using tabular data or interpreting tabular data on their own versus like writing code to interpret tabular data. These are sort of success metrics for different types of tabular data interpretation conducted earlier this year. And you can see that like the success rates range from up to like 80%, but a lot of the time it's like 20 to 40%. Also, they're bad for regression because basically they don't have sort of an understanding of number space in the same way we do. So for a lot of reasons, I would suggest building your own model rather than taking it straight from ChatGPT. So just to end on some final principles, relate the model to your understanding of the data generating process. That might involve a subject matter expert, but always you should be trying to get a better understanding of that underlying process. Take advantage of your data's spatial structure. That's why it's spatial prediction. Develop a model evaluation strategy, and complexity, especially when it comes to black boxes like AI or LLMs, is always a double-edged sword. And finally, if you need help getting started, feel free to check out the MBG package. And I've got about 30 seconds for questions. Any questions?
Did you ever find out what the correlation was in Nigeria?
What the correlation was? So for these, we don't tend to do sort of like causal interpretation because some of these models are so nonlinear. Versus like in some types of like clinical studies, you would do a bunch of like linear or like a logistic regression and then sort of correct for stuff. So it's more based on like how do we prioritize based on the outcome that comes out? Where do we direct resources based on that? Any other questions? Cool, I will hand it off.